In this video we're going to have a look at metabolic rate. So what do we mean by metabolic rate? Well, it's the quantity of energy used by the body over a given period of time. And when we talk about metabolic rate, we talk about it being measured in kilojoules or kilocalories or calories or joules. And when we're speaking about metabolic rate, we think of it in terms of respiration, aerobic respiration. And we know that the word equation for aerobic respiration is glucose plus oxygen gives us energy, carbon dioxide and water. So we can actually measure metabolic rate, and we can measure it by looking at the different things that are involved in that equation. So we can measure the rate of metabolism or the metabolic rate by measuring how much oxygen is used up over a period of time. Or we could measure how much carbon dioxide is given out, or we could measure how much energy is produced. And we're maybe not measuring the actual amount of ATP or the whatever, we're actually measuring the heat output that is there, because that is a measure of how much energy is produced. And we can measure the respiration rate using different pieces of equipment to do that. We can use things called respirometers and things called calorimeters, and we're just going to have a look at these bits of equipment just now. So first of all, having a wee look at a respirometer. Now basically a respirometer, you've seen these before. There's different types, and here's one here where what happens is, with this one here, you can measure how much oxygen the animal is using up. So this is a bit like the respirometers you saw in National 5. You've got here your wee living animal here. In this case, it's a kind of cricket looking animal. And you've got something that absorbs carbon dioxide. On the other side, in this other chamber that's here, you've got, it's just something that's representing the same mass as the thing that's absorbing the CO2 on the other side. It should ideally just have a screen here as well to keep this as the same sort of screen platform, and something up here that's inert, so maybe glass beads, something like that, that represent the same mass as the organism that's over the other side, just to make this a fair test. Now what the idea behind this is that the oxygen that is put in, that's in here, and you'll see that some gets injected into here. The oxygen gets used up by the respiring tissues of the insect, and as that happens, carbon dioxide is produced and it is absorbed into here. So what happens over a period of time is that as the oxygen is taken up, then the carbon dioxide is then absorbed, there becomes less gas inside the sealed chamber. And therefore what will happen is the level of liquid will move up to fill that gap, and as it moves up there can be a scale along here that can be read off, and obviously it would need to be timed, and you can time how much oxygen is used up over a period of time. I've got here on this slide here just a wee statement just giving a kind of rough idea that if a man is consuming 350 litres of oxygen in a day, that equates to something like 1700 kilocalories or 7000 kilojoules. You don't need to know that bit of information, it's just a wee throw in. So that's one way of measuring a metabolic rate using a respirometer. The other way is to use something called a calorimeter. Now these can be very sophisticated or they can be very simple. Now this one here is just a very simple calorimeter. All you've got here is, over on this side you've got a flask here that's got germinating peas in it, or some kind of germinating seeds, and it's sealed with cotton wool at the top, and there's a thermometer going down into the flask. Over on the other side, this is a control, there's boiled seeds in there, and what would happen is over time, as these germinating seeds are metabolizing, as they're respiring in order to start growing, then then heat will be produced, and that will be registered on the thermometer. And the boiled seeds, though, obviously they're boiled and they're not going to be doing anything, and so the temperature won't rise. Now, a more kind of complex way of measuring metabolic rate are more complex calorimeters, and the idea is you have a sealed room. Obviously, you're going to have to give the individual oxygen, and when they're in this insulated room, there are pipes going through that room, and what happens is that water are fed through that pipes, and as the individual that's in here, they're giving out heat, then the water will get warmer. So as you put the water in here, cool, and it travels along here, the warmth from the heat given out by the individual will warm up the water, and out here with the warmer water coming out here, the temperature difference is calculated and a metabolic rate can be calculated. Now let's just look at some terminology here. When we can use different terminology when we're looking at metabolic rates. We can just look at the whole of a body's metabolic rate, or we can look at a metabolic rate where we're looking at the metabolic rate per gram of body tissue or whatever, or we can use this term here called basal metabolic rate. Now, basal metabolic rate is really what the metabolic rate is when an animal is at rest. And at rest, the basal metabolic rate will obviously be lower than when the body is like exercising or doing a lot. And during that resting time, all that's really happening with your basal metabolic rate is it's the state that the body of energy that the body needs just to keep vital organs such as the heart and the lungs and the brain functioning properly. So if we compare metabolic rates, and really I suppose the kind of question I'm going to ask here is, if we were thinking in terms of an elephant and a mouse, well, which one of them would have the higher metabolic rate? Well, if you just think of it in terms of the whole organism, so our elephant and a mouse, then when you're looking at the entire animal, then obviously the elephant's going to win hands down. It's going to need, it's got way more metabolic tissue, if we think of it that way, in it than a mouse has, and so therefore its metabolic rate is going to be a lot higher. It's going to have to eat an awful lot more, and because it's got all this tissue that is here, and there's going to be an awful lot more metabolism that's going on there. But when we come to actually look at the mouse tissue, and elephant tissue, if we were looking at it per gram, we get this surprising thing that happens there. We find that per gram, the metabolic rate per gram of body tissue in a mouse is much higher per gram of body tissue than it is in elephant tissue. What, in actual fact, it uses far more oxygen per gram, something like 10 times more oxygen per gram of body tissue. So putting this kind of another way, the larger the organism, the higher the metabolic rate is. An elephant needs far more energy than a mouse. But if we were to cut out a gram of elephant tissue and a gram of mouse tissue, we find that the mouse tissue metabolizes about 10 times faster than the elephant tissue. So the mouse tissue, its metabolic rate per gram is higher than the elephant. Now, there are various ideas as to why this is, but one thought behind it is that this is all due to surface area to volume ratios. Your elephant has got a large volume compared to its surface area, whereas your mouse has got a much smaller volume compared to its surface area. So a mouse loses far more heat far more quickly than an elephant does, and therefore it's going to have to take in much more oxygen and metabolize that glucose an awful lot more in order to produce heat to keep its internal temperature at a regular or a balanced internal temperature. So that's one of the thoughts behind why you've got this higher metabolic rate. So when we look at basal metabolic rate per unit of body mass, and we compare a small animal compared to a large one, we find that the basal metabolic rate is higher per unit of body mass in small animals compared to larger ones. So I just wanted to explain what was on this slide here, because I think sometimes it can be a little bit confusing. So we're just thinking of it in terms of if we were just to excise a piece of tissue from each of these organisms, and you discover that this metabolic rate is higher in the smaller organisms. But if you were to look at the entire animal, then obviously we use up, as humans, we use up an awful lot more energy. Our metabolic rate is far higher, our energy needs are far higher than they are for a mouse. But compared to our body size, our body per gram, then the metabolic rate in a mouse is actually higher than us. And it would be the same if we were comparing ourselves with something like a hummingbird, anything that was smaller. And it's all, some of the theory behind this, it's not altogether known why is this that this occurs, but some of it is because the smaller animals are having to work, their body tissues are having to work an awful lot harder, I suppose you can think of it that way, to keep heat and to keep heat inside the body. And all of that is relevant when we come on to have a look at animals in different extremes of temperature and so on. So that is our summary of metabolic rate.